I want you to think about something before we begin. Think about the most honest person you have ever known. Someone who never took what wasn't theirs. Someone who showed up every single day without complaint, without recognition, without anyone ever stopping to ask how they were doing. Someone whose entire life was built on the quiet, unglamorous foundation of doing the right thing, even when the right thing cost them everything. Now imagine that person sitting in a courtroom, hands folded, head slightly bowed, charged with a crime they did not commit. That is what I saw on a gray Tuesday morning in late November. A woman who had cleaned the same house for 11 years, who knew the name of every houseplant, every creak in every floorboard, every preference of the family she had served with complete and unwavering faithfulness, sitting at a defendant's table while the woman who employed her sat across the room without once looking her in the eye. The charge was felony theft, a diamond necklace worth $12,000. And every piece of circumstantial evidence the prosecutor had assembled pointed directly at Dorothy Hargrove, a 54-year-old grandmother with calloused hands and a faded navy blouse, and not a single mark on her record in 28 years of adult life. The case on paper was already decided, but there was something in that room that the prosecutor had not accounted for, something that had been recording silently on the night in question. Something that did not care about social status or expensive attorneys, or the inherited confidence of someone who had never once faced a real consequence in her life. And when I asked for it to be brought forward, the entire room changed. Before I tell you what was on that footage, before I tell you what it showed, and who it showed, and the exact moment the most confident person in that courtroom realized she had made a catastrophic miscalculation, I need you to understand something about the woman sitting at that defendant's table. Because this story is not really about a necklace. It never was. It is about what happens when someone spends a lifetime being invisible, being useful, being faithful, being present. And then, one morning, that invisibility is used against them like a weapon. It is about what the law is supposed to do in that moment. And it is about what happens when just once, it actually does it. Stay with me. There are certain mornings in this profession that announce themselves before you even walk through the door. Not through noise, not through chaos, through silence. The kind of silence that sits in the corners of old buildings, in the grout between the tiles, in the brass of the door handles worn smooth by 40 years of desperate hands pushing through. The kind of silence that knows what's coming before the rest of the room does. That Tuesday in late November was one of those mornings. I remember pulling into the parking lot and sitting in my car for a moment longer than usual. The sky was the color of wet concrete. The trees along the courthouse steps had already surrendered their leaves, bare branches reaching upward like they were asking for something nobody had the authority to grant. The heater in the building had been struggling since October, and when I stepped inside, the air hit me the way it always did in the cold months. Old paper, burnt coffee from the machine on the second floor, and underneath all of it, something harder to name, something closer to fear. I had been a judge for 31 years at that point. I had presided over thousands of cases, fraud, assault, custody battles that tore families apart at the seams in ways that took generations to mend. I had heard confessions that made the room go cold. I had heard lies so polished and rehearsed that they almost fooled even me. Almost. You develop a sense for things in this job. Not a supernatural sense, nothing so romantic as that. It is simply the accumulation of 31 years of watching human beings under pressure, watching what they do with their hands when they think nobody is looking, watching where their eyes go when a question gets too close to the truth. You learn to read the room the way a sailor reads the water, not by any single wave, but by the pattern of all of them together. And that morning, before I had even taken my seat, before the first piece of paper had been read aloud, before a single word of testimony had been offered, the room was already telling me something. I settled into my chair. The wood creaked as it always did. I set my glasses on my nose and arranged the folder in front of me with the deliberate slowness that I have cultivated not out of vanity, but out of necessity. Slow movements calm a room. Slow movements remind everyone present, the attorneys, the gallery, the defendant, that we are not in a hurry here, that whatever happens in this room will happen with the weight and care that human lives deserve. I looked up, and I saw her. She was sitting at the defendant's table in the way that people sit when they have spent a lifetime being told, in 100 different ways, that they do not belong in rooms like this one. Not slouched, she was too dignified for that, but compressed, as though she were trying to fold herself small enough to apologize for the space she occupied. Her hands were resting on the table in front of her, fingers laced together, and even from the bench I could see the texture of those hands, the knuckles, the calluses, the particular roughness that comes not from one hard day, but from 28 years of them, layered one on top of another like coats of paint on an old wall. She was wearing a navy blouse that had been washed so many times the color had softened at the collar and the cuffs. There was a small dark mark near the hem, barely visible, half hidden beneath the edge of the table, that she had covered with a length of dark fabric folded carefully into the waistband of her skirt. She had done her best. That much was immediately and painfully clear. She had stood in front of a mirror that morning, in whatever small room she called home, and she had done her absolute best with what she had. Her name, I would soon learn, was Dorothy Hargrove, 54 years old, domestic worker, no prior record, not so much as a parking ticket in 28 years of adult life. Across the aisle at the plaintiff's table sat a young woman in a cream-colored structured dress and Italian leather heels that cost more than Dorothy's monthly rent. She was scrolling her phone beneath the table with the casual confidence of someone who had never once needed to fold herself small for anyone. Her name was Victoria Calloway Brand, and she had brought Dorothy Hargrove into my courtroom to be destroyed. I looked at Dorothy again. She wasn't crying, not yet, but her jaw was set in the particular way of someone who is fighting very hard not to. She had the look of a person who has been disbelieved before, who had already rehearsed in the sleepless hours before dawn the particular humiliation of not being believed again. I picked up my pen. I had 31 years of mornings like this one. And I knew, with the certainty that only those years can give a person, that whatever had brought Dorothy Hargrove to my courtroom, whatever series of events had placed her calloused hands on that cold table, the truth was in this room. My job, as it had always been, was simply to find it. The prosecutor stood up the way prosecutors sometimes do when they believe the case has already been decided before it begins, with a looseness in the shoulders, a slight tilt of the chin, the body language of a man completing a formality rather than seeking justice. He was young, 30s maybe, new enough to the job that he still wore his ambition visibly, like a second tie. He cleared his throat and read the charge. Felony theft in the first degree. 1 diamond necklace, white gold setting, 11 stones. Total appraised value, $12,400. Allegedly removed from the primary residence of one Victoria Calloway Brand on the evening of Thursday, October 14th, between the hours of 6 and 11 p.m. The defendant, Dorothy Ann Hargrove, was the sole individual with confirmed access to the premises during that window. He said it cleanly, efficiently, the way you read a grocery list. The room absorbed it. I watched Dorothy's hands tighten on the table, not dramatically, just a barely perceptible increase in pressure, the knuckles shifting from brown to pale at the joints. She had heard this before, of course, at the arraignment, possibly several times since. But there is something different about hearing the full, formal weight of an accusation read aloud in a courtroom, something that lands in the chest differently than it does on paper. It is the difference between reading the word storm and standing outside in one. A court-appointed attorney, a young woman who looked as though she had been handed this file approximately 40 minutes before walking through the door, shuffled papers quietly beside her. I did not blame her. The public defender's office in this county was understaffed by 30% and had been for years. She was doing what she could with what she had, same as Dorothy. The prosecutor continued. He presented the timeline with practiced clarity. Dorothy had been given a key to the Callaway Brand residence 11 years ago, when she was first hired. She had cleaned the property every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday since then, a schedule interrupted only twice in 11 years, once for a medical procedure and once for a family bereavement. Her access to the home was total and long-standing. She knew the layout. She knew where things were kept. She knew specifically that Victoria's jewelry was stored in a hand-carved mahogany box on the upper shelf of the master closet. He paused there for effect. He then noted that the necklace had been reported missing on Friday, October 15th, the morning after Dorothy had been alone in the house. That Victoria had personally witnessed Dorothy near the master bedroom on a prior occasion, that no signs of forced entry existed, that no other individual had been confirmed on the property during the relevant window. The circumstantial architecture of it was, I had to admit, competently constructed. Taken in isolation, each brick looked solid enough. An experienced employee with total access, a valuable item, a window of opportunity, no other apparent suspects. I had seen innocent people convicted on less. I had also seen cases like this one before. Cases built not on evidence, but on the elimination of alternatives. Cases where the real question being asked was not who did this, but rather who is the most convenient person to have done this. There is a particular cruelty to that kind of prosecution. It does not announce itself as cruelty. It presents itself as logic. Victoria, for her part, sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Dorothy's head. She had not looked at Dorothy directly once since the session began, not once in 40 minutes. That, too, was a data point. The prosecutor concluded his opening and returned to his seat with the same easy confidence with which he had risen. Dorothy's attorney stood and offered what she could. A brief assertion of her client's clean record, her long service, her character. It was honest. It was earnest. It was not enough, and everyone in the room knew it. I let the silence settle after she sat down. Then I did what I always do before I begin asking questions. I took off my glasses. I held them in my hand. I looked at Dorothy Hargrove. Really looked at her the way I had learned to look at people over 31 years. Past the navy blouse and the careful posture and the tightly laced fingers. Past the fear, into the exhaustion underneath it. There is a particular exhaustion that belongs only to people who have spent decades being careful, being quiet, being grateful for what little they have and asking for nothing more. It lives in the eyes in a way that is unmistakable once you know how to recognize it. It is the exhaustion of someone who has never once been able to afford the luxury of being believed without proof. Dorothy Hargrove had that exhaustion. Victoria Callaway Brand did not have it, not even close. I put my glasses back on. I leaned forward slightly, and when I spoke, I kept my voice at the same register I always use for the question that matters most. Low and unhurried, the way you speak to someone standing on a ledge. Dorothy looked up at me for the first time. Her eyes were dark and steady and full of something she had been holding for a very long time. I said, "Tell me something, Mrs. Hargrove." The room went completely still. "Why don't you tell me? In your own words, take all the time you need. Exactly what happened in that house on the night of October 14th. She didn't answer right away. That was the first thing I noticed. Not hesitation born of guilt. I have watched guilty people pause, and there is a particular quality to that silence, a calculating stillness, the almost audible sound of a person deciding which version of a story to tell. This was not that. This was the pause of someone who has been asked to speak in a room that has never once invited their voice, and who needed a moment to believe that the invitation was real. She unfolded her hands, laid them flat on the table, looked at them briefly as though checking that they were still her own. Then she spoke. She told me she had arrived at the house at 8 in the morning that Thursday, as she always did on Thursdays when the schedule shifted. She had let herself in with her key. She had cleaned the kitchen first, then the bathrooms on the lower floor, then worked her way upstairs the way she always did, methodically, room by room, the same pattern she had followed for 11 years until the house knew her footsteps, and she knew every corner of it. The way you know a place you have given yourself to completely without ever being asked if you wanted to. She had not gone into the master bedroom. She never went into the master bedroom when Victoria was away unless she had been specifically asked to, because Victoria had made clear early in their arrangement that she valued her privacy in that room above all others. Dorothy had respected that boundary for 11 years without exception. She had finished her work by 2 in the afternoon. She had locked the door behind her. She had taken the bus home, the number 47, the same bus she always took, the one that stopped 2 blocks from her building. She had picked up her grandson Marcus from her neighbor Mrs. Chen, who watched him after school on Thursdays. Marcus had a fever that afternoon, 101.4 degrees. She had spent the rest of the evening on the floor beside his small bed with a damp cloth and a thermometer, and the particular concentrated terror of a woman who cannot afford to take a sick child to the emergency room, and is therefore managing the situation with everything she has, which is love and experience and very little else. She paused there. I asked her gently, "How old is Marcus?" 7, she said. "He'll be 8 in February." I wrote that down. I don't know why. Perhaps because I wanted her to see me writing it, to know that it had been heard and recorded, and that it mattered. I asked her if anyone could confirm she was home that evening. She said Mrs. Chen had checked on them twice, that she had called the nurse's line at the clinic at 9:47 p.m. She still had the record on her phone, because Marcus's fever had climbed to 102, and she needed to know whether to take him in. The nurse had advised her to monitor through the night and bring him in the morning if it hadn't broken. She had not slept. The fever broke at 4:17 a.m. She knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock. The room was very quiet. I looked at Victoria. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, she was not looking at her phone. She was looking at the table in front of her with an expression I had seen before. Not guilt exactly, not yet, but the preliminary awareness that something is about to go wrong in a way that cannot be managed by charm or money or the inherited confidence of someone who has never faced a consequence in their life. I asked the court technician to bring up the security footage. He had it ready. I had requested it before the session began, which is why Victoria's attorney had spent the first 20 minutes of the morning looking increasingly uncomfortable, in a way he was trying very hard not to show. The footage appeared on the monitor. The timestamp read Thursday, October 14th, 23:47. The camera angle covered the upper hallway of the Callaway brand residence. The image was sharp. The lighting was the automatic night mode of a high-end system, the kind wealthy people install to protect the things they value. The irony of that would not escape anyone in the room for long. A figure entered the frame from the left, tall, blonde, wearing a silk robe, moving with the unhurried ease of someone alone in their own home, which she was. She walked directly to the master bedroom door, entered, and the camera lost her for 40 seconds. When she returned to the hallway, she was carrying something small in her right hand. She paused briefly under the hallway light. The necklace caught it. 11 stones, white gold setting, a brief cold flash of light. before she folded it into her palm and moved out of frame toward the staircase. The secondary camera covering the foyer picked her up at 23:51, placing a small item into the interior pocket of a travel bag near the front door. I let the footage run until it ended. Then I let the silence do its work. Victoria's attorney put his pen down on the table with a small, definitive sound. He did not pick it up again. I took off my glasses, held them in both hands, and I looked at Victoria Calloway Brand with the full and undivided attention of 31 years. "I want you to understand something," I said. My voice was very calm. It is always very calm at the moments when it matters most. The law is a patient institution. It does not lose its temper. It does not raise its voice. It simply waits, and eventually, without fail, it sees. Victoria's jaw tightened. A muscle moved beneath her cheek. She was calculating still. I could see it, running the numbers, looking for the exit, the way people do when they have lived their whole lives in rooms where exits always existed. There was no exit here. I picked up my pen. "The charge against Dorothy Ann Hargrove," I said, "is dismissed immediately and with prejudice. Her record will reflect no arrest, no proceeding, and no association with this case of any kind." Dorothy made a sound. Small, involuntary, like something that had been held underwater for a very long time, finally breaking the surface. I was not finished. I turned back to Victoria. "As for you," I said, "I am going to sentence you to something far more difficult than a fine. I am going to require you to sit in this chair, in this room, and listen to exactly what you attempted to do to this woman. Not the legal language of it, the human reality of it." I leaned forward. "You attempted to take the one thing Dorothy Hargrove has spent 54 years building in spite of every obstacle this world placed in front of her. Not a necklace, her name, her unblemished, irreplaceable, hard-won name. And you did it, as far as I can determine, because it was convenient, because she was there, because you calculated, correctly based on how this world usually works, that nobody would look too hard at the accusation if the accused was a poor black woman and the accuser was you." The room was absolutely silent. "You calculated wrong," I said. "I ordered restitution of $8,000 payable to Dorothy within 30 days to cover lost wages, legal costs, and damages. I referred Victoria's conduct to the district attorney's office for review of charges related to filing a false police report and obstruction. I recommended in writing that her father, whose name was on the property and the security system, be made aware of the footage in full." I brought the gavel down. The sound of it filled the room completely. I have presided over thousands of cases in 31 years on this bench. I remember a fraction of them with any real clarity. The mind is merciful that way. It does not force you to carry every story at full weight forever. Most of them soften with time, blur at the edges, become part of the general accumulated sediment of a long career, rather than individual stones you can hold in your hand and examine. But some cases do not soften. Some cases you carry the way you carry certain photographs. Not because you choose to, but because they chose you. Because something in them reached past the professional distance you have spent decades carefully constructing, and touched something underneath it that you cannot name precisely, but that you recognize without question as the part of you that became a judge in the first place. Dorothy Hargrove is one of those cases. I think about her on mornings like that Tuesday. Gray mornings, cold courthouse parking lots, the smell of burnt coffee and old paper and something underneath it all that is harder to name. I think about the way she sat at that table, compressed, careful, taking up as little space as possible. And I think about everything that had conspired over the course of 54 years to teach her that that was the appropriate amount of space for a woman like her to occupy. I think about Marcus, 7 years old and burning with fever on a school night, while his grandmother sat on the floor beside him and watched the clock, and could not sleep, and could not afford to be afraid, because fear, for some people, is not a luxury they are permitted. I think about all of it. more than I probably should. But I also think about what came after. 6 weeks after that Tuesday, I received a letter. It was written by hand, on plain lined paper, in the careful, deliberate script of someone who was taught that handwriting reflects character and has never forgotten it. There was no return address on the envelope. She had written her name instead, in the upper left corner, as though that alone were sufficient identification, as though Dorothy Hargrove were an address unto herself. She told me that the restitution had been paid in full, on time, without contest. Victoria's attorney had delivered a cashier's check without accompanying correspondence. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the check, in an envelope, through the mail, like a bill being settled. Dorothy told me she had used a portion of the money to pay 3 months of rent on a proper 2-bedroom apartment. The first time she and Marcus had had separate rooms since he had come to live with her. She described in a single sentence the first morning she watched him wake up in his own room and not know immediately where he was, because it was new and unfamiliar and his. And I had to set the letter down for a moment before I could continue reading. She told me that Mrs. Chen had cried when she heard about the new apartment, that Marcus had insisted on carrying every box himself, even the ones that were clearly too heavy for a 7-year-old, because he wanted to help, and because he understood, in the way children understand things they have not been explicitly told, that this was important. I folded the letter very carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of my robe. I still have it. What Dorothy did not know when she wrote that letter, what I learned approximately 3 months after that Tuesday from a colleague who moved in legal circles adjacent to the Callaway Brand family, was that Victoria's father had seen the footage, all of it. The full security record, including the timestamp, including the travel bag, including every second of what his daughter had done and had attempted to do to the woman who had cleaned his property with perfect faithfulness for 11 years. He had not called her, he had not written. He had instructed his attorney to remove Victoria's name from the trust documents and to inform her, in formal legal language, that she would need to make her own arrangements going forward. I confess I did not feel sorry for her. I tried. I always try. It is part of the job, the attempt at minimum to hold space for the full humanity of every person who comes before you, including the ones who have used their humanity in ways that are very difficult to defend. But when I searched myself honestly for sorrow on Victoria Callaway Brand's behalf, what I found instead was something closer to the flat, quiet recognition that consequences, when they finally arrive for people who have long been insulated from them, are not cruelty. They are simply the world correcting its own math. 6 months after that Tuesday, I was contacted by a legal aid nonprofit that operated 2 floors below my courtroom, an organization I had referred defendants to many times over the years, quietly, in the margins of other cases. They told me they had recently hired a new client advocate, someone to sit with working-class people who were navigating the court system for the first time, who were frightened and confused, and who needed someone beside them who understood not just the paperwork, but the particular texture of that fear from the inside. Her name, they told me, was Dorothy Hargrove. I sat with that for a long time. There is a version of justice that is purely procedural. That counts itself satisfied when the correct verdict is rendered and the correct paperwork is filed and the correct boxes on the correct forms have been checked. That version of justice is necessary. It is the skeleton of the whole enterprise. Without it, nothing stands. But there is another version, the one that happens after, the one that cannot be mandated or legislated or handed down from a bench. The version where a woman who spent 28 years making herself small in other people's houses walks into a courtroom, not as a defendant, not as someone being processed by a system that cannot see her, but as the person whose entire job is to make sure that the next Dorothy Hargrove is not alone when the charges are read aloud. That version of justice is not something I can take credit for. Dorothy built that herself, with the same hands that scrubbed those floors, with the same quiet, indestructible dignity she carried into my courtroom on a gray Tuesday morning in November, when the sky was the color of wet concrete and the heater was barely working, and the world was, as it so often is, arranged against her. I have been a judge for 31 years. I have never once regretted this work more than on the days when I see what people are capable of doing to one another in the dark. And I have never once been more grateful for it than on the days when I see what they are capable of building in the aftermath of that darkness. Quietly, stubbornly, without permission or applause, simply because it is the right thing to do, and they know how to do it, and they are still standing. Dorothy Hargrove was still standing. That is everything. If this story stayed with you, if Dorothy's dignity and the weight of what she carried and the quiet miracle of what she built afterward meant something to you, then you already understand why these cases matter. Every week, people like Dorothy sit at tables like that one, alone, afraid, and certain that nobody is looking closely enough to find the truth. Subscribe so that the next time someone like her walks into this courtroom, you are there when it happens. Because justice, in the end, is not something that happens to people. It is something that happens because people are watching. If this story stayed with you, take just a moment and ask yourself something honest. Have you ever been the Dorothy in the room, the person who did everything right, who showed up faithfully and gave everything they had, and still found themselves having to prove their own innocence to people who had already made up their minds? Have you ever watched someone use their privilege not as a responsibility, but as a weapon, and felt the particular helplessness of knowing that the world was arranged to believe them over you? And if you have been on the other side, if there was ever a moment when you judged someone quickly by their clothes, by their address, by the careful way they tried to take up as little space as possible, what did you do with that moment afterward? Tell us in the comments. Every single one gets read. And if you believe in stories about dignity, about justice finding its way through, and about the quiet strength of people the world keeps trying to make invisible, this channel is where those stories live. Subscribe, and we'll make sure you never miss one.